Greetings. This is just an introduction to welcome you to this week's Featured Trends Forum. Our guest is Liz Norell, who is from the University of Mississippi, who has written a really splendid, warm book on how faculty can be more present for their students. Uh, I really enjoyed the conversation that followed. I think you'll see a really good flow of questions from the audience and a very, very thoughtful and supportive guest. So, without any further ado, here's the show. I hope you enjoy. So, so just welcome everybody to the Future Trends Forum. I'm really glad to see all of you here today. We have a terrific guest who's written a really powerful and warm book. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. Let me begin by just quickly introducing our guest. Liz Norell, the University of Mississippi, has written a fantastic book. I'll put a link to it here in the chat. There you go. On the question of being present, for the years of the forum, we've looked at teaching very, very closely. We've looked at it from multiple angles in terms of professional development. We've looked at grading and ungrading. We've looked at labor issues. We've looked at mental health issues. We've looked at structural support, lots of sessions on teaching and learning centers. But I think what's interesting here is that Liz has this book where she asks about how to make a professor or instructor of any kind present for students and what the benefits of that are and how to actually do it. I find the book to be absolutely charming, to be very warm, very thoughtful, very accessible, and I'm just delighted to be able to host her. So I'm going to call you Director Norell once, and then I'm going to default to the informal. Liz, tell us just really, really quickly, after this book has come out, what are you going to be doing for the next year? What's top of mind for you in terms of ideas and also what kind of practical things are you going to be doing?
Thank you for having me, Brian. And it's really fun to be in a room with so many people I know and people who I want to know. So thank you all for joining us. What am I going to be working on for the next year? Well, most pressingly, I have a paper that I need to write for a class I'm taking for
Oh,
fun. And
oh,
the class is on race and ethnicity, and I'm writing a paper about racial equity in specifically mathematics education. So people who know me will know why I'm writing about that. But basically, I taught a math class last semester and I had a very eye-opening experience. So I'll just leave it at that. But beyond that, I'm doing a lot of really fun travel and talking about the book, which is great. But when I'm thinking about like what's the next big project that I tackle, I have a number of ideas and I don't know which one I will tackle immediately next. But I'm thinking a lot about psychological safety in higher ed and in classrooms and for instructors and staff
oh,
as well. So I've been thinking a lot about that. I've been thinking a lot about disability and neurodivergence for a while now. And I know Karen Costa is here and she's doing great work, as are others. And so I haven't really figured out if there's a unique way for me to contribute to that scholarship, but I certainly do a lot of talking about it. And just in general, trying to figure out, oh, I'm also working on a study about students' perceptions and beliefs and behaviors around reading for their classes, undergraduate
ooh,
students. So
ooh.
I did a pilot study this semester at the University of Mississippi, and that's not what we're here to talk about today, but some really interesting and probably not terribly surprising, early results from that. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about, and where I go next kind of changes day to day depending on where my curiosities are taking me.
Well, it's wonderful that you can do that, and it's wonderful for the rest of us because we can benefit from all of your work in that. And I would that reading work, whatever form that takes, we'd like to circle back and bring you back to talk about that because that's a subject that's very, very dear to a great deal of people
Mhm.
right now. Um, and Liz, just to jump in, I put a link to the book in the chat, and I want to commend it to everybody here. I have so many questions about it, but one of the ones I want to begin with, the first is how how can you get faculty to be present when all the incentives are for them to be professional, analytical, impersonal? I mean, their faculty are often rewarded for their scholarship. They're often rewarded for their intellectual institutional pedigree. Especially a lot of fields have a long history of either you cite our mutual friend Kevin Gannon of being performatively badass and being tough. And also, we are, in many ways, as instructors, we're avatars of a field. We're representatives of biology or history or philosophy. How can we decloak from that? I mean, how do we get past all of that and actually become human to our students?
Well, the word that you used there in the last part, Brian, I think is important, and that's human. So right now in higher ed, we're having a lot of conversations. I'm constantly against my will talking about generative AI. I would prefer to never talk about it ever again, but it's all over the place. And I think that faculty, instructors, colleagues that I work with feel very threatened by it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that to the extent that we lean into the humanity, which requires some presence, that's how we address this perceived challenge from generative AI, which is very flat and emotionless and kind of regurgitating things it's heard before. I know that that's part of our disciplinary norms and our academic norms, but I look around me for the last 6, 7, 8, maybe forever years, and there's all this conversation about faculty burnout and overwork and stress and a lack of boundaries between our work and our lives. And I think that we have lost the ability to be human about our work. And so, how do we be present? We be present because the alternative is just not sustainable and will be overwritten by what generative AI can do.
So that's a whole subject for an entire session for an hour at least. Is thinking about the challenges that generative AI places on us for being fully present to our students. And folks, if you're new to the forum, we've had a whole series of sessions in AI, and we've got a bunch more coming up. But beyond generative AI, am thinking of the other forces that push us to become professional, to become academics, to become the John Houseman character in the Paper Chase. How can we all stop doing that and be more human and not lose, and not be punished by our colleagues, by student evaluations, by our departments in doing so.
That's a really big question, Brian. And if I had the answer to that, I would probably be doing something very different right now. But I think that what you're really getting at is culture, and it's the culture of our departments, our disciplines, and our institutions. And culture changes very hard, and it moves slowly often. That said, I think each of us, as my friend Rebecca said in the chat, we have what's right in front of us. And so we, we need to figure out how to build relationships among our colleagues that prioritize our shared humanity. And I think we also, especially people who are tenured, who have the great privilege of tenure,
Mhm.
that they have a real responsibility to not perpetuate the systems in which they got tenure, but to imagine a system that allows more people to sit in those positions of privilege and security. Unfortunately, I think most of the people who are doing this work, agitating for more humane
Mhm.
academic cultures, are not tenured because they're sort of the canaries in this coal
Mhm.
mine of higher ed where they're suffering and they have no protections. And it's simply not sustainable to prioritize that level of productivity and a kind of automatic, emotionless ways of being in this climate where everything feels like an existential threat every single day.
They can, and sometimes they are. It, well, let me see if I can fumble around a little bit further and ask one more question, and then I would really like to hear from everybody here. And that is, what does being present to our students mean? What does that practically look like?
Yeah. So, first of all, I just want to say that when I say be present, or when I say that authenticity matters, I don't ever want anyone to feel like that means that you need to drag your whole self into the classroom, warts and all, and that we need to be mindful of our intersectional identities and the context in which we work. So for some people, being fully present, being fully authentic is simply not safe, and we should not demand that. That said, I think being present to our students is being able, at least the way that I talk about it in the book, it's being able to feel comfortable enough with who you are in the role as instructor that you
Mm,
are not kind of obsessively monitoring your word choice, your body language, what you're wearing, how you're moving,
mm,
all of those things, so that your, available working knowledge, capacity, your cognition can be directed towards the people who are learning with you. So
mm,
let me give you an example. Just like an hour ago, I was having a final grade conference with a student who I have not seen since February. And so he submitted his final project. I confess a good portion of it was probably generated by AI. And I know this student to be passionate and curious and energetic and positive, but clearly something along the way interfered with his attention to and commitment to the class. And so presence for me looked like saying, look, we're going to figure out your grade at the end of this conversation, whatever. But just tell me, like, how are you and what's really going on? And
mm,
tell me how
mm,
you use AI in your work. I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to police. I'm curious. And then we looked at the learning objectives together. And I said, I want whatever grade we decide on to reflect how much you feel like you have made progress towards these six learning objectives. And he kind of went through them and he's like, well, I feel really good about two of the six and like,
mm.
about the third. Right. And then having a conversation about that is not judgy or critical, but just kind of curious and trying to figure out how do we recognize the totality of the things that are happening in your life and also think about how are you making progress towards this thing that you're here to do.
And how did that end up?
He had initially proposed a grade that I would have thought was a little higher than
Mm,
perhaps was merited. But when I asked him, look at these learning objectives and then tell me what grade you think reflects how far you've made it towards these, he proposed a grade that I thought was much more kind of sensible. And then we started talking about challenges that he's had with motivation, and I shared a couple of resources, and he said, "Can I come talk to you in the fall because I feel like you have a lot of
yeah,
knowledge and I think you could really help me." I was like, "Yes, you can come to me anytime." And so I
that's
felt like
great.
we ended it on a really good note, because he said, "I don't feel judged. I don't feel shamed." So I think
Mm.
that's the best we can hope for, right?
Well, thank you. Friends, if you haven't had a chance to read Liz's book, there's a whole chapter where she has a dozen examples of professors being present, and they're very, very diverse faculty, and they're doing that kind of presence work in very diverse ways. Liz, but I was going to encourage everybody to ask questions. And whenever I start to do that, people usually beat me to the punch. And already we've had a discussion between Michelle Miller and Ed Webb, focusing on the word curiosity in terms of presence. Michelle quotes you saying, I'm not here to judge, I'm not here to police, I'm curious. And Ed Webb follows up by saying curiosity is vital and its absence can be deadly. Modeling curiosity is essential to teaching. It seems like what you're describing is an instructor who is genuinely curious about the student, about their lives, and about their passes through your class. Is that right?
Yes, yes. I was just earlier this week listening to an episode of Teaching in Higher Ed with Bonnie
Mhm.
Stachowiak, and she
Yeah.
was talking to Trisha Bertram, I'm not gonna Gallant, I think, about her new book and with David. And Bonnie was talking about the four agreements, and one of them is don't take it personally. And I think curiosity
Mm, mm,
comes when we can take our own propensity to take things personally out of the equation.
mm,
And that applies in teaching, but it also applies in politics and political discussions. And I know Ed mentioned our current politics are dominated by incurious people, right? Because it all feels so personal. So, like, whether the student is using AI, whether the student is committed to my class, that has nothing to do with me. It's about the student. And so I don't need to involve my own ego in that conversation. And that's where I think real curiosity can flourish.
Oh, I love that. Oh, that's terrific. I mean, that's one great thing for everyone to take away from this session, I think. The Our mutual friend Karen Costa says she follows from Covey's Seven Habits: seek first to understand and then to be understood, which is quite a reversal for faculty who are usually trained to do the opposite. Friends, you can tell this is a great time for your questions. So again, if you're new to the forum, please feel free to use the chat. People there are very friendly. We haven't had any bad puns yet, which I'm really surprised by, and we haven't had any footnotes yet. Although I think we'll get some of those coming up soon. But if you don't want to do that, please use the chat box, which is definitely there. Please use the Q&A box rather, which is definitely there for you. And a colleague of mine, Kenan Salinero, has this to add, which I think is a really good example of what you're talking about. As faculty at Georgetown Chemistry, they brought up a student on charges of cheating, which were found out to be valid. Later, the student had to retake their class. Well, we had a frank conversation about what was going on for her. We ended up being able to work together effectively, and she did well in the class on the retake, which is a really, really good story. Um, Liz, that sounds like a good example of the professor being present.
I agree. And if we can think of, I think part of it too, and this is from, sort of not taking it personally, but I always tell students, like, I care about you as a person. Your work matters to me, but it's not going to affect how I feel about you as a person. So the relationship is between two people. The work is something that you're doing in pursuit of some goal that you have. And how you choose to pursue that goal is your business. And I'm here to perhaps help or coach or motivate or cheerlead. But anything you do related to the pursuit of your goal is not going to change how I think about you as a person, unless you're like, violate my trust in some way, right? But you would have to go really far down that for that to change. And so I do think that by the end of the semester, students recognize that, I'm not going to come into a final grade conference where we're collaboratively deciding their grade in a way that's being, super critical. But I also just want to say that that's the same way that I approach my colleagues and the faculty that I work with, right? So when a faculty member comes to me and, has what I would describe as perhaps uncharitable ways of talking about their students.
Wow.
I'm not here to like tell you that you're wrong. I sense that there is some sort of emotional harm that's been done here, perhaps because you were taking something personally. And I see that as an opportunity to try to help you navigate to a more healthy relationship with the way that you're seeing your students and the way you're thinking about your students. I'm fortunate, I think, that my partner doesn't agree with me on anything about teaching whatsoever. And so he's always coming to me with like gotcha questions like, okay, what would you say if a student was doing this? And he thinks he's finally going to get me to say, well, they're just terrible. And I always say, well, that's interesting. So, like, why would that be bothersome? And then he's like, no, don't do it again, And so we have these wonderful conversations where I think we can really pull back some of that propensity to take things personally and really think about why alternative and perhaps more charitable interpretations of why people do things. And I noticed Mark put in the chat about the Metta Sutta about loving kindness. That's something that is in the book. There's a whole chapter on yoga and the yamas and niyamas and how we can apply them to teaching. I just love, Mark, that you brought that out. And I don't know if you've read the book or not, but I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, Mark is a remarkable person, and so I'm really glad he did that. I want to follow up on that, but just one quick note is it sounds like what you're talking about is remarkably low on ego, which is what was the old joke? Teachers get into teaching elementary school because they love their students. They get into teaching high school because they love their topics. They get into teaching in college because they love themselves, right? How do we undo that enormous ego investment? What are some ways that, I mean, you do this professionally, not just in your book, but also in your work in the Teaching and Learning Center. How do you do this without it blowing up and being horrible?
I think a lot of academics, and I'm speaking of myself here in addition to anyone else who might feel implicated in what I'm about to say, the ego is so active because it's compensating for a sense that we might not be good enough, that someone is going to find us out. And the ego gets really loud when it's defending itself. Thank you, Tim, for admitting, right? So the ego can be quite, like laissez-faire when it feels confident.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the ego gets involved when it's less sure and it feels the need to prove its worth.
Hmm.
So, what you're describing, Brian, I think is what happens when people feel that fear that, some people might call it imposterism, imposter syndrome,
Hmm.
imposter phenomenon. I think sometimes that gets overused because it's really the systems, it's not the people. We have created systems where people are trained through graduate school that
Hmm.
every argument is just waiting for that decisive blow of an argument that will crumble it down. And we are trained in graduate school how to make those arguments so that we appear smart. These are ways that the ego feeds itself. These are not ways that humans get to know each other and enter into trusting relationships. So I think that, yes, there is a lot of ego, but it's the ego defending a perceived fear of being discredited.
Well, thank you. That's a great answer. And friends, you get a sense of Liz's writing from how beautifully she framed that. Um, but going back to yoga, thanks to Mark's intervention, we have a question from Karen Costa who says, "Liz, I'm reading your bio online and didn't realize you're a fellow student, a teacher of yoga. I'm curious how your yoga studies and practice inform how you relate to higher education." So I can say, Karen, you have to read the book. There's at least a whole chapter just on this, which is great. But please, let's go ahead.
Yeah, I started yoga teacher training the same year that I started my tenure track job. So I was about halfway through it when I started that tenure track job. And it's been remarkable to me how helpful being a yoga student and a yoga teacher has been in my own teaching work, my learning work, and also my work with other faculty, because I think it teaches a kind of mindfulness and presence in the moment. Certainly, the whole book is kind of predicated on that. But I also find that the tools of just listening to the information coming from the body that we often just disconnect from because we want to believe that we're just brains and the body is kind of supporting that. But we're actually much better at cognition when we take advantage of all of the wisdom that our bodies process and communicate. So I I feel that that ability to connect with what's happening in my body and be attentive to that in the moment is incredibly helpful. As I said, there's a chapter in the book that talks about the yamas and niyamas, which are one of the limbs of or two of the limbs of yoga, and talks about them in a teaching context. So I feel like that is something that I had never seen before, but it's really helpful for me to think about like how do I want to bring these ethics of yoga into the ethics of my own teaching, right? So one of them is to do no harm, right? Ahimsa. And so how do I think about my teaching in a way that tries to create a space where people are not harmed? And that's something that I think all of us would prefer to have, but looking at it through the lens of yoga can give us a different way to think about what that might look like in our teaching.
Wow, that's terrific. In the chat, you've got a lot of fans, and including a lot of people who are supporting your efforts to work in yoga. And and so I think this is so that's a great intervention to bring into this. Ed Webb adds that he spent a lot of time in grad school and since unlearning the Cartesian dualism that he learned as a kid, trying to reintegrate mind and body and to show up as an embodied person, not an abstraction. Um, how so for the moment, setting aside technology and that this is a fairly low embodied venue, um, how practically how can we do this? I remember going into teaching the first, I don't know, it's 5 or 6 years, and I usually had a suit and tie. Very, very careful to project a very professional, conservative, not politically, but culturally conservative um, venue, and that's in many ways hiding the body and setting it aside. How do you do this? Do you suggest movement exercises in the classroom? Do you rearranging the space of a class? Or what do you recommend?
I'm going to giggle that you said rearranging the classroom, Brian, because I am well known among my like on-site colleagues as a chaos agent when it comes to classroom furniture. I hate
Yes.
rows. And
Yeah.
I also strongly believe that and I have done experiments and this bears out. Sometime maybe I'll write about it. The room tells students what's expected of them in very unconscious ways and they do it. So I had a writing class once that was in an engineering room that had like 50 seats in rows that were tiny packed together. But this was like a 15 student first year writing class and they never wanted to talk. But if we left the room, they were chatty. And so
Hmm.
it's like, okay,
Hmm.
the room is telling you to sit down and shut up. And so, yeah, that's just an aside. I could talk about that all day. It's
I'm
another
with
one
you.
of my hobby horses that maybe someday I'll do something with. But I think the bigger question is, I don't know that we need to explicitly have like yoga in our class or meditation or moments of silence or breathing or whatever. But when the energy of my class feels very flat, when the students feel very checked out, I will often just ask them all to like stand up or stay seated and just stretch for a minute, just for a minute. And sometimes I'll even have them get up and walk around and I'll tell them when to stop kind of circulating and I'll ask them to give someone a high five and just say hello and introduce themselves. And you do that a couple of times. That's not great for every student. Like some students are going to be very uncomfortable by that cacophony and so there's always an option to opt out and normalizing that. But just a way to like get people to kind of shake the tree a little of the energy and get more kind of in their body in the classroom. It's really hard because we are not taught how to do this and we are not modeled best practices or even like an awareness of our body when we're going through graduate school. As new educators, Brian, what you said about putting on a suit and trying to project
Mhm.
an image, I think a lot of us do that, especially when we're young, because we're afraid that people won't take us seriously. But the more that I can be closer to who I am in my everyday life, at least in how I present myself, whether that's dress or mannerisms or things I talk about, the more that I can be embodied and be present in the classroom. So again, I don't want anyone to feel like they owe the world their authentic self at work because it's not always safe. And for people who are young, it can be really hard to feel like you're going to get the respect that you're looking for by being who you are when you're just a few years older than your students. But we're looking for opportunities here, ways that we can nudge ourselves into feeling more comfortable with ourselves so that we can be more attentive to our students.
I love that. I love that. Years ago, God, I want to say 1999 or so, I did a workshop where we had a brilliant exercise. There are 5 or 6 of us faculty, and we were instructed to teach the others a first year class for 5 minutes in our fields. So a political scientist taught 5 minutes on voting. I taught a little bit in literary theory. A Latin prof taught on verbs and so on. And they recorded us in video. And it was a shocking thing to see yourself teaching. I mean, now it's more common because devices are more common. I mean, ballet is kind of the origin of this, where you always see yourself in a mirror. But it was really surprising. And the other instructors said, "My God, you move around so much." And apparently, I was just like, going out of frame of the camera and running around a lot. Um, and that's just well, but that's I asked this question based on not using technology. Now, in the chat, we've had some questions about technology, and one of them was one person said that she, let's see, was teaching online asynchronously and was wondering how to be present in that way. This is Carrie Muir. She says, I struggle with showing my students I am present or embodied when I currently teach entirely online asynchronous courses. Um, I'm curious, what advice do you give for breaking through that glass barrier and making the students and the teachers all feel embodied?
Mhm. It's hard. It requires intentionality, but it's not impossible. So before I started at the University of Mississippi 2 years ago, almost, I was working at a community college, and before that, as a tenure track professor, and before that, I spent about 15 years as an adjunct. And so during that like 20-year period, about half of my classes were asynchronous online.
Mhm,
I do think that it is possible to be present and to feel like embodied in that work, but it requires intentional attention to that space. And it really does require effort on our part to show the students very early in the semester that we are seeing them as individuals and we are building relationships with them on a one-on-one basis. Ways that lead us away from that, I think, and I don't mean to throw any shade or criticism, but I think that most students, and as an instructor, me, find the post once, respond twice modality of engagement in an asynchronous online class to be very artificial
mhm,
and not very humane. Like we're not getting a sense of each other, right? It's,
mhm,
there's so many great memes about, wow, Brian, I see that you talked about the sky being blue, and that's such a great observation. And it's just it feels so forced. So are there ways? Yes, and Tolu points out Michelle Pacansky Brock has done great work on this. There's so many smart people writing about this. Karen is incredible at this too, Karen Costa in the room. Um, it just requires that commitment to forming a relationship with your students, which hopefully we're doing no matter what modality we're teaching in. And, for me, so I'm just going to share this is what I do, and I've been doing it since COVID started. But I have seen no reason to stop. I give students my cell phone number and I tell them to text me. And I know that for some people that is a bridge too far and
yeah.
you would never do it. I have found that students do not text me gratuitously. They do not text me in the middle of the night, but my phone's off anyway, so it's fine. And it's actually a very quick way for them to get in touch. And it's so humanizing
Hmm,
because the
hmm.
first thing that I ask my students to do, regardless of what modality I'm teaching them, I ask them to send me a selfie of them that day so that I know what they actually look like and it's not just their
Ah,
student
ah,
ID photo. And then
right.
I create a photo roster from that. And when they text me that, I send them back a picture of my dog, not the one who's over here asleep, but the one that's
Ginger.
outside. She's a basset hound. She's adorable. She's sassy, and they're always, excited to get a picture of Ginger. And so we've started this off on a very kind of human way. And then I just tell them, just send me it. Like if it's a long thing, that needs a formal response, you can email me, but just text me. I'll see it. If you have a quick question, it'll be faster.
That's so
And
sweet.
that's been wonderful.
That's very, very sweet. I love that. In the chat, Mark Corbett Wilson said that one online instructor taught the class to say hello in American Sign Language, and then they had to text, sign that to each other as they went around. It was wonderful. Karen Costa mentions having students do a video of themselves. I had one colleague, dear friend Ryan Craig, who had his students pick out a music video that represented themselves and then created a big video compilation of that. Um, oh, and there's more people being mentioned in the chat. This is great. Well, thank you, Liz, for these great answers to these questions.
Let
You're
me just also say other people have done this, but I also get a lot of leverage out of in my start of semester questionnaire where I ask students, kind of like what's going on in their lives. I also ask them, what's the song that you're listening to on repeat right now? And I build a Spotify playlist and share it with the class so they can kind of hear the
oh,
diversity of
nice.
what their students are playing.
The class soundtrack. That's
Yeah.
great. Oh, thank you. Um, Katie Evans has a different question. She asks, any thoughts on how these approaches to teaching, if widespread, could or should relate to the current public perception challenges of higher education more broadly? And in particular, this might relate to alums or past students of our institution who did not feel they had these kinds of teachers or don't feel that higher ed classrooms or mentorship experiences were as worthwhile.
So I mean, I would like to think that our alumni
Hmm.
would want us to do better when we know better, to butcher the Maya Angelou quote. But in terms of like the current environment, I do think that it's easy to say that a lot of what we do in higher ed is there's sort of a lack of value add when it feels like we're doing mass production of education in large lecture halls where you're a number and everything is done in a testing lab or on a a computer platform with the lockdown and everything like that. That just feels like not that much of a value add over other options. The value add for higher education is the lived experience of it. It's the relationships, it's the challenges that we feel like we can face because somebody told us that they felt like we could do it, right? And the encouragement along the way. I still remember a professor I had as an undergrad. I was taking a class. She was a law professor, and I never wanted really to be a lawyer, but she assumed that I did. And she said, "You're going to be a great lawyer someday, but this paper is just not where it needs to be right now." And
Cool.
she said this while I was sitting in a rocking chair in her class, and she sat in a pretty uncomfortable chair. And I worked so much harder because she said, you're gonna get this. And I otherwise would have looked at that paper and a sea of red ink and thought, okay, well, I guess this is just not for me. Right? Those are the things that motivate us to keep going. And I often tell people, like, we're all smart. Like, we're all here because we love learning. And we would find ways to learn no matter what context we were in. Yet, I still take classes for fun because I will learn more if I'm in community with people and I have someone who loves the topic and has organized a study of that topic for me, right? So I'm taking this class this semester that's super fun. I've learned so much because I find that it's valuable to have conversations in community. It's why we have this program right here. So we want to be in community. And so that's the story that we need to be telling about higher ed. And I don't think that that is as easily critiqued as it is when you've got lecture halls of 600 people taking multiple choice tests in a lockdown browser situation, right? Like,
Yeah.
where's the humanity in that? I don't know.
If I remember your book rightly, you said that after that experience of legal writing, that you then went on and you got your own rocking chair, which you've used ever since.
I did. I don't have space in my office for it right now, but every time I do have an office that will um, make it possible to bring that rocking chair in, I bring it in and I invite students to sit in it when they come to see me in my office.
Well, Katie, thank you for that terrific question, which is really rich, and Liz, thank you for that superb answer. In the chat, our good friend of the West Coast, George Station, draws attention to three phrases, three words. That value add is helping a light go on for him. He also says that we use the word learning, but that's always about degree attainment. And then he mentions the word community is often misused at the institutional level. And Mark Corbett Wilson goes on to say that community is misused across digital platforms as well. And George, if you want to say more about any of those, please, of course, feel free. Always glad to hear from you. And Liz, Brent Presley recommends that you use a rocking chair in your virtual background, just to be helpful, you know.
The rocking chair requires a bigger footprint than a regular chair, but I do have a
Yep.
cozy chair in my office that has a smaller footprint that I invite students to sit on when they come to visit. I also have lots of snacks. I always have lots of snacks.
That's very smart.
Yeah.
That's very smart. Um, well, friends, while people are thinking about this, and they're probably getting hungry, and they're either stretching out on the floor on a yoga mat, or they're hunting around for a better chair. I have a question I'd like to put to you. I'm trying to imagine what would happen to a college or a university that said, okay, this is right. We need to do this. And that they took your book and they gave it to all the faculty and they brought you in. And maybe they brought in Leo Felton from Elon University to talk about relationship-rich education. And then they changed the teaching and learning center to really emphasize this. And they had workshops to change departmental culture to really, de-egofy instructors. And the provost would, go out of their way to have funding in order to make sure that departments would really support relationship-rich teaching. I'm curious, what does that look like after about, say, 5 or 10 years? What does what does the the student-centered world look like after this?
I've taught at lots of different kinds of institutions, and the world that you're describing, I've never seen exactly like that.
Hmm.
But parts of that exist in a couple of places, and they are community colleges and they are small liberal arts colleges, where there is a culture of deep relationship building. So I taught at community colleges for years. And just this weekend, I was in Chicago for a conference, but I had dinner with a former student who was in my class at a community college 10 years ago. And we're still in touch and are now quite close and is doing remarkable work working with immigrants and refugees in Chicago. So, like, that I think that happens in these smaller spaces where you don't have super large classes and where people are given the freedom to focus on their teaching. Now, that's not to say that the scholarship part of being an academic doesn't matter. It does. But I think we need to rethink the incentive structures that we have around investment in teaching in higher ed because there are people who want to invest a lot of effort in being great teachers, and they are structurally disincentivized from doing so because they're told that that's not what matters. And so I like that, like on my own campus, there's now a pretty robust teaching track in addition to the research track. And they are, on a tenure kind of track. They can get promoted, they can get tenured without doing research. And I think that more of that is really helpful. But ultimately, what would happen is we would see really deep investment in understanding one another. That goes both ways, always, right? That's students with faculty, it's faculty with students, it's staff and faculty, it's faculty with one another, right? Thinking about how do we make this a place where we can all thrive. And I'm not overly optimistic, or idealistic, I should say, but I am optimistic that we can make changes and that those changes probably are going to start in our departments. So I'm very grateful to work in a department. It's small. A lot of you know the people I work with, but we embody this in everything we do. We are deeply humane.
Hmm.
We, kind of give and take depending on how much capacity we have. And we always assume the best intentions and give each other the benefit of the doubt whenever anything comes up. I remember like my second week at this job 2 years ago, I went to an HR orientation and it was just terribly inaccessible. Like everything about the way this event had been set up made it difficult for anyone with any kind of disability or attention challenge or had a different kind of body shape or whatever. It was terrible. And so they sent out an evaluation and I was quite honest, and then I got an email asking me to come meet with the chief human resources officer of the college. And I was like, oh, I've screwed up. Okay. And I went to my boss and I said, okay, I think I'm in trouble. And he
Yeah.
said, first of all, you're not. And secondly, if you are, it's okay. We'll make it, it'll be okay.
Oh,
That was
oh,
exactly what I needed to hear, right?
oh, yeah.
And then I went to the meeting and they were like, we want you to help us be better. Tell us what we can do. And it was incredible, right? That's the kind of psychological safety that we need to build into our institutions so that we are all working towards being a better version of ourselves in everything.
Mm, mm. What a great place that would be.
Yeah, I
What
agree.
if we have time, I won't want to circle back to that. Friends, we have about 10 minutes left. I'll make sure all the questions came in. George Station followed up by saying that he thinks institutions are still recovering from 2020, 2022. The simultaneous push for back to campus experiences while pushing for AI implementation has got to be causing some cognitive dissonance at the admin executive level. Not sure faculty or admin side can solve this alone.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, George, but I will say that, in my work with faculty day to day, they're definitely feeling a lot of cognitive dissonance around AI policies and or the lack thereof, and kind of how we're pursuing it. So I think, just today, our campus had an AI task force meeting where, the group that's sort of taken the lead on giving faculty advice around AI has been they're developing some AI guides for faculty, but at the same time, of how to use AI in their instructions. And at the same time, faculty are just terrified that students are not doing any original work anymore. And we see a lot of reporting in our national education media about that. And so, I think that there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in this space. And I saw Tom's question there. Have I used AI as a tool? I have not, Tom. I'm not a fan of AI in most circumstances. There are a few use cases that I find useful. One of them I'll just share with you all is a website called Goblin Tools. So Goblin like the ghost, goblin.tools. And it's really great, especially for students who might have some executive functioning challenges where they can like give it a task and it'll break it into specific discrete steps. It can also help you read tone in emails or communication. So my husband and I talk about taking things to the judge, which is what it's called all the time. Should we ask the judge what this email says? Um, that's really the only use case of AI that I've found particularly helpful, but that's not really about humanizing.
Well, Tom, thank you. I mean, Tom has always a gift for good questions. We have a couple of more questions that are in here, Liz. I want to make sure that we get a chance to touch on these. Anna Karina Cruz, if I'm right, our Mexican ally, asked, how can this work in a higher ed environment that sometimes is obsessed with evaluation, evidence, certifications, etc.?
Yeah, I think that like everything, we need to think about how we can do humane assessments and evaluation. So I think a lot of, there's that old adage, not everything that can be counted is something that counts. Right. And so I often think that the rush to like, think counting how many credit hours or GPAs or, full-time equivalents and everything, like, of course we have to track these things, but that doesn't mean that they're the things that should be most important. So, for me, like in my conversation with my student a little while ago, it was, okay, I want you to reflect on how much progress you've made towards these learning outcomes and then let's settle on a grade that reflects that. To me, that's a much more humane way of doing, kind of assessment in a class. And I think that there are ways that we can, continue to feed the obsession with evaluation, evidence, certifications, et cetera, but do it in more humane ways, in ways that allow people to recognize their humanity and the fullness of their lives.
You begin one of your chapters with a quote from our mutual friend Jesse Stommel talking about ungrading. Um, well, thank you, Anna, and thank you for that answer, Liz. We have another question, and this is from Karen Costa, who is just becoming the third term in our conversation, I think. She is so good. Karen says, I know you've spoken openly about your neurodivergence. If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd love to hear how that supports your teaching and presence work and or what barriers you face. I suspect that neurodivergent educators can break some of the academic molds we spoke of earlier.
Yeah. So somebody asked me recently, I think it was Sarah Silverman, who many of you may know, asked me where in my book I talked about being autistic. And I was like, oh, let me find it. And then I went and looked and it's not in there. So I thought it was, but apparently that got cut out at some point, and I don't think that was intentional. So it should have been. I am not at all reluctant to talk about this, as Karen notes. So I am autistic. I also am probably ADHD, although I've not been like formally diagnosed, but I have a lot of the same traits. And I certainly have a great deal of anxiety. So Um, I talk about this pretty openly, and mostly because neurodivergence was probably the reason that things went so badly at the end of my last job and why I'm now at the University of Mississippi. If you read the book, you'll learn much more about that. But I think that for a lot of people who are neurodivergent, and there's a great book called The Canary Code by Ludmila Preslova about this, they are the canaries in the workplaces because when things are not working well, when the culture is not psychologically safe and supportive, the people who are neurodivergent will feel it first and feel it most. And so we have the ability to perceive injustices, inequities, and kind of problems, a lack of psychological safety in the workplace. And if people listen to us, which is always the trick, if you will listen to us, then we can help you figure out how to make it more inclusive and more supportive. And so I think that there is a real missed opportunity in higher ed as elsewhere to take advantage of the intelligence, the different intelligence and different strengths of your neurodivergent colleagues and students to build more inclusive and healthier work environments. And I wish everybody would. And I will talk about that with anyone anytime. So like I apparently I didn't talk about it as much publicly when I was applying for my job, and I think that was probably intentional. So my coworkers like didn't mention it for the first year I was here, and then I was like, "Oh no, you can talk to me about it anytime." Like I have no qualms about talking about any of that stuff. So anytime is fine.
Well, thank you, Karen, for the question, and Liz, I admire your answer and I admire your boldness in coming forth on that. Friends, we have about 4 minutes left. I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to share their thoughts and to ask their questions. In the chat, Keenan Solinero asks about Robert Boyce and his work, and he was wondering if that's still considered elemental to the humanization of teaching. Um, Keenan mentions that they were able to interact with him a fair bit at the end. Is Boyce someone that you would like to speak to, Liz?
I'm not familiar with voice, so I don't know, but maybe I'll look it up. It sounds like a good. I love it when people give me new things to read. So yes.
Oh, yeah, that's always good. That's always good. If I can, this is such a warm and convivial discussion, and what I'm about to say may threaten that. So, everyone could hold on for a second. Although this is coming up in the chat. How how can we do this work in this environment? This is an environment where a lot of colleges, the very powerful and rich, and also the very poor, are suffering financially and in reputation terms. We're seeing more than 1,000 international students deported. It's possible that this fall we will see a good number of academic cuts, layoffs, enrollment decline. Um, I'm trying to be as analytical here as possible and as calm as possible, but the situation is pretty dangerous for higher education right now. How can we do this kind of work in such an environment?
Well, it is really hard, and we have to make sure that we don't get so engrossed in the doom scrolling that we lose hope. So I have been occasionally reading chapters of Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in the Dark. I recommend it. I think that community is resistance. So being together with people like this, I feel like that's really important. And finding your community and finding your joy where you can is what sustains our ability to continue to fight for the things that we care about. Everything that I write about in the book and everything we've talked about here, I think is very important for us to clarify what matters most to us and what we want our lives to be, because we only get one of them and we don't get to redo it, right? So we should spend our time on the things that matter to us and living in a way that feels um, concordant with our values. And so, that's how I answer that question. Like, yes, it's hard. It's really hard. And, I have friends who've lost their jobs, who've lost their grants, who I
Mhm.
know people who've had, family members deported. Like this is going to affect all of us. And the only way through it is to not lose hope and to remain in community with each other because we are ultimately all we have is each other, right? So that's how I think about this.
In the in the chat, Frank Erling quotes appreciatively your line that community is resistance,
Yeah.
and I hope in some small way that the future Transform can be that kind of community. Um, However, we are bound to a schedule, and we've just hit the end of the hour. So after that magnificent answer, Liz, I have to ask, how can we keep up with you? I don't mean intellectually. I mean practically. How can we keep learning from you and following your work?
Well, so I'm most active on Blue Sky, and it's just Liz Norell, one R, two L's. So I feel like we're among friends, right? No, this is going to go on YouTube. I can't. Well, I'll just say it.
Yes.
I'm just like a little bit more right than left. Sorry, a little more left than right. So I have two L's and one R, right? That's how you remember, not two R's and two L's.
Ah.
Little bit more left than right. So you can find me on Blue Sky. I am on LinkedIn. I don't check it as much. I don't really understand that algorithm. But you can also just email me. I'm easy to find. And I love hearing from people. I'll put my Gmail in the chat because I am living in a state that has now banned DEI. And so I don't want anything in state email that people might be concerned about being
Mm,
FOIA'd or requested. So
understood.
you're
Understood.
welcome to use my Gmail. And yeah, I love it when people reach out and want to talk about something or want to work on something together or read a book together or any of that. So please feel free.
Well, that sounds fantastic. Liz, you've been a terrific guest. You're doing really important work. Everyone, I encourage you all to grab a copy of Liz's book and run with it as both practical guide and inspiration in these times. Liz, thank you for spending the time. Our best to your hardworking dogs. And I hope you all got to see my cat as he made an exploratory mission across me. Um, but thank you very much. Now, but don't everyone go away. Just to let you know, if you'd like to look into our previous sessions, where we cover, among other things, faculty development and relationship education, head to our archive of the website forum.futureofeducation.us. We have sessions coming up on policing higher education, on how higher education went from mission driven to margin obsessed, and a critical session on AI. Please, excuse me, everybody, thank you for your time with us. As Liz mentions, this kind of presence is special, and I'm really glad to have been thinking and feeling together with all of you. Please take care of yourselves, be well, and we'll see you next time online. Bye bye.